everyone? True Techno Gamer here, and back for another home theater focused video. So I got a lot of great feedback on my home theater videos and kind of be branching out into that section for the channel. The subwoofer video I did, lots of great feedback. People saying I helped them make their purchasing decisions, which is kind of, the point, right? I wanted to help pass along a lot of the learnings that I gathered in 20 years to just help folks that may be interested in this stuff and looking to make their own purchases. So for this one, now this is going to be a fun one. I'm going to talk about one of the most common misconceptions and one of the easiest areas to trip up on if you're looking to get a new receiver or a amplifier specifically, on how to interpret the power rating specs that you see. It's actually a really complicated thing if you don't know how to look at them and what to look for. And being able to look at the numbers to really get a feel for the quality that you're going to get. Because you can actually learn a lot from the numbers. But you can't learn everything, of course. You got to listen to it, but the numbers tell you a lot. And there's a lot of misleading information out there, and there's a lot of misconceptions about how to interpret those specs, right? So I want to focus it on the perspective of looking at what do you really get when you increase the price and increase the quality across receivers, and then jumping into separates when you get a separate amplifier, and then going up in price on that. So there's a very big difference from a $200 receiver that's 5 channels, right? That can get you started for home theater for sure, to getting a separate 5-channel amplifier that's $5,000, right? I mean, what are you really getting, right? And the numbers tell that story. So I want to break down and kind of give you guys a crash course on how to interpret those power ratings, make sure that it's clear to explain it. I'm going to approach it from, I'm a regular user, regular person who is just interested in looking to purchase this thing and, just kind of wanting to know what I'm getting, right? And I'm going to go through it with you guys, and we're going to look at several websites and several brands and several products, and I'm going to show the specs and show how it changes as you go up in the line, and if you look at even different websites, the different pieces of information that you might get and what to really look out for, okay? So if you take nothing else from this video, understand that you cannot look at the power rating, like when you see the watts, you cannot look at that number in isolation and in a vacuum, right? If you see a spec that says 140 watts, that by itself tells you absolutely nothing. There's at least 4 key pieces of information that you really need to see in a power specification in order to actually draw any conclusions on the quality of that amp, right, or receiver, okay? There's 4 pieces of information, so follow me. So the first obviously is the watts, which is the actual power output, okay? But you can't look at that by itself. So you have the watts. The second piece of information you want to see is the actual frequency that power is representative of. So 100 watts by itself, nothing. 100 watts at 1 kilohertz, okay, that tells you something. But ideally, a really high quality amplifier is going to be able to achieve its power across the entire audible frequency range. So the standard at this point for what the audible frequency range is for the perfect human ear is 20 hertz all the way up to 20 kilohertz, okay? So you want to see 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz as like the frequency range. So you want to see frequency. The third thing you want to see is the actual resistance in ohms, right? So in circuit design and in circuitry, the speaker naturally is a resistor, okay? So on average, most loudspeakers today, on average, is 8 ohms. They're rated at 8 ohms resistance, okay? So, and some higher up speakers go below that. They go down to 6 ohms or even 4 ohms. Keep in mind, a speaker doesn't like stay at one single ohm rating. It fluctuates as it gets signal, right? But generally speaking, 8 ohms is the average. It may go down. As it goes down in ohms, as it goes down in resistance, the power that's requested from the amplifier is higher. Less resistance, more power. So you'll see that in some boutique brands, some really high-end speakers, they may be nominal at 4 ohms, right, on average, and go down to even 2 ohms. And that could be a problem for, a low-quality amplifier, because it's going to be asked to deliver power into that speaker that it just can't deliver, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. That's why the arms are important. We're going to talk more about that. And the fourth thing that you want to see is the actual total harmonic distortion, or THD. That's how it'll say. It's the amount of distortion, okay? There's obviously going to be some distortion. You can't get around that. But a really high quality amplifier is going to minimize that distortion. Less than 0.1% total harmonic distortion is generally considered good. You're not going to hear it. You're not going to detect it. Anything like definitely above 1%, you start getting into, okay, that's kind of bad. It's kind of noisy. Just to give you a general ballpark. But most, like, again, high quality amplifiers and reputable things are going to be somewhere 0.1% or less. Okay, the higher distortion, the worse it's going to sound. So that 100 watt for a $200 amplifier could be 100 watts with 10%, total harmonic distortion, whereas that's a $2,000 amplifier can have 100 watt rating, but it's at 0.0005%, right? So that second amplifier is going to be a lot cleaner, sound way better. So that's what you need to keep in mind. So I'm going to go with you, take this journey. We're going to look at some examples, look at these ratings, break down how to interpret them, and what it looks like when you go up in price and quality. Alrighty, so let's start by just looking at Best Buy, right? Best Buy is, mass market. Everyone knows it. They have a lot of equipment. Like I said, I'm gonna focus on Denon because Denon has a good range of products at different price points, so we can see how it evolves, right? So here I am on BestBuy.com, and let's just start looking at this again. Trying to get into this thing. So here's like the Denon, this S540BT is kind of one of their entry level receivers, 5.2 channels, 4K Ultra HD, etc. So let's click on that. Now, what I'm interested in is, remember the four specs that I said you need to have to really determine the quality, right, of the amplifier. Okay, and so we're at Best Buy mass market. It's kind of catered for people that probably don't know about this stuff, to be frank, and are not willing to invest a whole lot, which is $299 is a pretty good price. And we come here and we want to see the specs. We want to know what kind of amplifier this is, or receiver this is, right? So let's look at the amp section. What do we see? Well, key specs. Watts per channel RMS. RMS is root mean squared, which is basically a fancy way of saying the average or sustained power, okay? So it says watts per channel RMS, 140 watts. Whoa, 140 watts. That doesn't seem that bad. $299. So you may have heard, may know, there are receivers that cost 5 times that much, $1,500 or more, that are rated at 140 watts. There are separate amplifiers that are rated at less than 140 watts, and they cost several $1,000s. So that doesn't seem that bad, right? I mean, hey, but to my point, what's missing here? We see 140 watts. No other information. So that number tells us nothing about what this amplifier really is capable of. What is 140 watts? What frequency? How much distortion is there? All right. We don't know, right? We have no idea. So we clearly need some more information. Now, this is typical of Best Buy, right? And if you go in person and you try to ask someone, at Best Buy a question like this, they're going to say, oh, yeah, it's 140 watts. They don't really know what they're talking about. Just keep that in mind. Now, let me show you another example. This is the same receiver right here, okay? But this is a website called Crushville. And for those that don't know, Crushville is, it's a digital storefront. They've been around since, 1974 here. They've been around for a while. And they have a ton of products, a lot of home theater, audio, speakers, smart home type stuff, car audio, etc. And I kind of look at them as like, Magnolia Plus, right? But for digital. So anyone can access them. They're accessible. They do free shipping around the country, around the world, I believe. So these guys know what they're talking about. In fact, they have a whole learning section here on this site where you can go to and get a lot of tutorial videos and explanations on everything you could probably need to know about home theater and audio. So these guys know what they're doing. This is a step up from a Best Buy. Same processor though. They have things here that are pretty, entry level. And let's just click on this because I want you to see what the difference is in terms of the information you can get from a more reputable and kind of more pro audio focused place, right? So that same processor immediately in the overview, what do we see? Power and processing, 5 channels, right? 70 watts per channel. But more information, into 8 ohms resistance, right? Remember I was talking about that. Frequency range, 20 to 20,000 hertz at THD, total harmonic distortion, at 0.08 distortion with 2 channels driven. So that's another piece, okay? Now, that is everything you need to know to kind of get a feel for this amplifier. Let's go back to that Best Buy page again. What do we have? Nothing except for this 140 watts. So wait, how did we go from 140 watts to 70 watts? Okay, this is the more true, accurate reading here. This tells us what we need to know. 70 watts per channel. Remember, this is a 5-channel amplifier. So what that says is all 5 channels are capable of 70 watts. Okay, but this part here with 2 channels driven is the key when it comes to receivers, okay? And it tells you a lot about how receivers are limited, right? And the concessions that need to be made. Because frankly, a receiver is one box. So you have to fit the preamplifier that basically makes the signal ready to be amplified, the processor that does all the surround processing and, adding all the audio, effects, so to speak, to the sound, and the amplifier. Okay, into one box. And in this case, it's a $300 box, right? You obviously have to make some concessions given the laws of physics. So what happens with receivers is when you see a power rating, it usually almost always means with 2 channels driven, which is assuming like a stereo signal. And what happens is as you add more channels, or if you can imagine a situation where more channels are active at any given time, the power is going to go down, because receivers are powered from a single power source. So in this case, this 5 channels, they all have to share that power source. So if only 2 of them are active, you get 70 watts. But if all 5 are active, which is going to happen in a movie, right? You got the surrounds on, the center speaker, right? If all 5 are active, you're going to get way less than 70 watts. And I'll show you what that looks like. In this case, you probably get more, something like 50-ish watts, okay? But just keep that in mind. But we have everything. So 8 ohms, that's, again, typical nominal ohm rating for most speakers. And then this frequency range here is 20 to 20. That's, again, the full range of human hearing. So this is good. And 0.01, I remember I said 0.1 and below is considered pretty good. You're not really going to hear a lot of distortion at 0.1 or below. So we're under that. So, okay. Right, so this is representative of what you would get here with this processor. Okay. Now, how do we go from 140 watts rating on Best Buy to the 70 here? The answer actually lies when you look at Denon's website directly, okay? So here's Denon's website. Here's that same processor here, $299, right? Let's click on it here. And when we go to Denon's website and look at their individual specs, I'm gonna click on here, specifications, takes us down. So what do we see? Let's look at the actual specification tab. So here it is. The number of amps, 5. The power output, 8 ohms, 20 to 20, 0.08, 2 channel driven, 70 watts. Okay. Now we see some other numbers here. 6 ohms, 1 kilohertz only, 0.7% distortion, 90. And then of course, look down here, 6 ohms, 1 kilohertz, 10% distortion with only 1 channel driven, we get 140 watts. Guys, this is it, okay? Are you following this? And I'm laughing because, like, this is the kind of stuff, again, this took me 20 years to wrap my head around. I'm giving you guys this. I'm accelerating you guys, right? This is the kind of stuff that you see when you get to the entry-level things and you look at mass market places like Best Buy. When they put this 140 watts with no context, they lied. They were lying their behind off, right? These numbers are horrible, okay? What happens with an amplifier, again, less ohms, less resistance, you're going to pull more power from the amp. That doesn't mean the amp can handle that power, but that's what's going to happen. So when you give this rating at 6 ohms, it's kind of misleading because, again, most speakers are 8 ohms, right? So if you're using your 8 ohm speakers, you're not going to see 140 watts. That's first of all. Then second of all, let's look at the frequency. Again, we care about the entire frequency range. Having 140 watts at 1 kilohertz, that's one individual frequency out of 20,000 frequencies, right? That doesn't help. That doesn't tell us anything. And again, it's always harder to maintain a certain power level across a frequency band. So if you just isolate one frequency, of course you can inflate the number, which is what they're doing. It's going to be higher, right? Apply that to the full frequency, it's going to be way lower than 140. That's point 2. Point 3, are you kidding me? 10% distortion? Guys, that's 100 times more than the 0.01% that I said was generally acceptable. 100 times more distortion. If this amplifier, if this receiver ever hit 140 watts, it's almost going to be inaudible. You're not going to even be able to listen to it. It's going to sound so distorted. Okay, so you're never going to see this thing hit 100 watts, right? Point number 3. And then point number 4, only one channel driven. In what world is only one speaker on at any given time? At least you're going to have, stereo. You play music, you're going to have a left and a right speaker, right? You're going to play stereo. With most home theater and movies, surround sound, you got 5 speakers, 5 channels. You're not going to see one channel driven at one time. That's a horrible rating. What you really care about is all channels driven at the same time, and I'm going to show you that. But in this case, one channel driven, again, the rating typically in the real good rating here at least has 2 channel driven, which is what's important. At least that tells you, like, you're playing music consistently, consecutively, both speakers are on and active. That's what you're going to get. So the real number here again is 70 watts. That's the best rating we can get. But again, with a home theater application, 5 channels driven, it's going to be less than that. It's probably going to be around 50 watts. So just to give you an idea, that's pretty much what you're going to be looking at, right? Is about 50 watts. Okay. So this is important. This is cool. Now, what happens when we kind of go up in price a bit? And let's go from $299. Let's just jump up. This is a $1299 receiver. Okay, this would be considered mid-range here. This 3700H. Okay, so we go here. Let's jump down to specs. So let's see what this looks like. Again, this is 4 times the price, right? What happens at 4 times the price? Well, with a receiver, again, you're still fairly limited. So the ratings you're going to get are still 2 channels driven. They never really give all channels, all 5 channels. In this case, there's 9 amps. So again, the more power amps you have, the more channels you get, the lower the power is going to be when all of them are active. Keep that in mind. So 2 channels is 105 watts. So we went from 70 watts at $299 price point to now 105 watts at $1,300 price point. That's a nice gain, but that's not tremendous, honestly. But again, it's just 9 channels. So remember that other one, I gave you an idea, probably around 50 watts with all 5 channels driven, right? So here, 2 channels driven, 105 watts. You can probably bet that 5 channels driven is probably going to be somewhere around the 70 to 80 watt range. So closer to what that other entry level amp was doing with only 2 channels driven. You can get that performance now with about 5 channels driven. And then if you get to 9, you're probably going to be below 70 watts. It's hard to say. It may be somewhere between 50 to 70 watts, 50 to 60 watts. So basically, with all channels driven here, you're probably going to get the same as the 5 channel driven on the entry level watts. So what happens here is you get more of that clean power, but spread over more channels, right? Essentially. So with 9 channels, you can get what you can get at the entry level one with only 5 channels. That's one way to think about it. Other than that, yeah, there are other some other features here. In general, this is now an 11.2 channel receiver as opposed to the entry level one being only a 5 channel receiver, right? But it only has 9 amps. So keep that in mind. But so this is what you get with the money. But in terms of the actual amplifier, it's not a dramatic difference, right? I mean, you get some more power. It's not like it's double the power or something, but you do get some more power clearly, and you do get more channels to power it, right? So that's what happens there. And quickly, let's look at like a really high end Denon. Let's look at this 8500H. That's $4,000. This is their flagship. This is as high as it goes for Denon, right? So now what do we get? Well, besides all the features and all the technology, all the surround processing you want, you go to the specs. Where are we at? So now we have 13 amps in this one. So the other one had 9. The entry level one had 5. We have 13 amps. But the power rating, again, 2 channels driven. Distortion is now 0.05. Remember, it was 0.08 with the entry level one. Not going to be something you can tell. But we're at 150 watts with the 2 channels. Again, there's 13 channel amps in here, right? So again, if you try to spread it out over that 13 channels, that 150 is going to go down to probably less than 100 for sure. Probably closer to that 70, 80 watt range, but across 13 channels now, not just 2. But 150 watts per 2. So again, a good amount more power. We're over double the power now that we started out at that entry level amp. But again, that amp was $299, and now we're at $4,000. $4,000 for this receiver, and we're only at 150 watts. So this is a general rule of thumb that kind of top out at the 150 watts times 2 with 2 channels driven. That's pretty much what you max out at. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so let's put that all together, and I want you to see what it looks like when you scale up in the number of channels that the receiver or amplifier has to do. So I talked about how 2 channels driven is going to be higher power rating than 5 channels driven, 7 channels driven. And this is an example of that. So this is a website called Sound and Vision. And what you see here is they when they do their reviews, they actually do a test bench. They benchmark the receiver and they graph it. And again, they're looking at, you cannot look at the power in a vacuum. You can manipulate the power ratings, or you can just see that a receiver or amplifier is going to have a different power rating depending on what the resistance is, depending on what distortion you're looking at, and how many channels are being driven. So what you see here is 2 channels driven, 0.1% distortion, 123 watts. That kind of aligns with, what the Denon specs say, right? Now you increase that to 1% with distortion. As you go up in distortion, you're going to get more power out of it. It's just not clean power. So now you're at 147. You increase that to 5 channels, you see you go down, like I mentioned. So 0.1%, 123 watts with 2 channels goes down all the way to 97 watts with 5 channels. And then similarly, going down to 7 channels, now you're at 72 watts. So now you see what I was saying before. And then again, 1% is going to be higher, but you still see the drop. Okay. And this is the graph of what that looks like. So on the y-axis, you have the actual total harmonic distortion. Basically, the range that we care most about, that would be ideal, would be this portion here that's kind of below 100 watts, where it's 0.005. So that's like really, really low distortion. And again, that's not where they rate it at, right? They rated it at 0.05 up here, or 0.08, or sometimes even 0.1. So you do get a higher rating, but you see it's not at all stable there, right? It's on a steep curve heading down, heading up. But it's really not stable except for when you're at like 90, 95 watts or less, all right? So here it is, right? Just keep in mind how this works. So again, you have to look at the whole picture. And if you're looking at home theater receivers, the number of channels, the number of amplifiers that's in the receiver matters, right? And more channels usually means less power per channel. Now, with that said, let's see what happens when we really step it up and go to some of the boutique brands. I'll show you like Anthem and Rotel for their receivers, because they actually make receivers and like separates. And then let's see what happens when we actually step it up and go to separates. All right, so here we are at Anthem's website. Now, for those that don't know Anthem is a Canadian company, and they specialize in primarily home theater, but they actually do some 2-channel stuff. They're pretty high end. They're a really respected brand in the world of home theater and audio. So they build some really, really high quality receivers, some of the best receivers out there. And then they also have some really, really, they have ranges that go up to almost $10,000 for their amps. So Anthem builds 3 receivers, and you see them here. Their entry level receiver is $15.99. Okay. And as you see here, they're top of the line, 11 channel amplifier, but 15 channel surround receiver is $3,600. Okay. Look at the MRX 540 here. What do we get when we step up in a receiver? Well, so they have a lot more detailed specs here. First of all, I want to just point that out. Okay, so we're dealing with a higher level company, focusing on like audiophile quality, a lot more information. So I'm not going to delve into all of this, but let's go back to our output parameters. What do we see? So they actually have the power ratings for the entire receiver line, so we can see how it goes up. Now notice the specs here, channels 1 to 5 and the remaining channels. So what they did is they separate the power that goes to the 5 main channels in a 5.1, center, left, right, and then left, right, surround, and then the other channels, which could be rear surround and your height speakers for Atmos, okay? The reason for that is that the rear surround and the Atmos speakers don't get nearly as much sound information and don't need as much power, quite frankly. So it's kind of a smart move. Again, you have to make concessions in a receiver, right? In a single box that has to do all of this work, preamplifier, processor, and amplifier. It doesn't matter, what price range you're going to be at. So that's just one way that they did it, and it makes sense, okay? So for the 5 main channels, we get about 100 watts, okay, up to 140 watts for the next level up, and then it's also 140 watts for the 1140. The difference is that one has just more channels. So you go from 5 channel to 7 channel to 11 channel. So they're delivering that same 140 watts with 11 channels. The remaining channels in this case is 60 watts. So again, you're ultimately getting a lot more power. But overall, it's not a grand difference, right? There's a bigger difference in build quality, aesthetics, but the power, that 100 watts per channel, is for the entry level one, for the 540 that we saw. That's again with 2 channels driven. You see that there. So we're still not getting like an all channels driven kind of thing. It's going to go down from there a bit when you do all channels. So you still are dealing with the general concessions of a receiver. Okay. Now let's take a look at another, kind of more audiophile brand in Rotel. What's interesting here is that Rotel has, again, they build processors and receivers and amps. So there's a good A and B comparison we can do here between a receiver and then a power amplifier. So when looking at Rotel, right now they call it the surround amplifier processor. That's a receiver. We have their highest end one here, the 1580 Mark II. Now let's again look at the details. The layout looks great. Again, that's that single power supply here in the middle. And you can see the specs. And see things like the weight too. So look at the weight, 50 pounds. The amplifier section requires heft. That power supply, the capacitors, they take up a lot of weight. You always can tell the general quality of a receiver or of an amplifier by the weight. Now there's different class amplifiers, and I'm not going to get into all of that. Literally, they call them class A, class B, class AB. There's class D, there's class H. That's another video. But just know that most amplifiers, most like traditional amplifiers, are class AB. Okay, and for a class AB amp, it does scale where it requires more weight to generate more power, more high quality power at that. So if we go back and look at the Denon, that Denon receiver, I'm looking back at it here. If we look down at the weight, we see here that the weight of that receiver, this is what the high-end one, was 51 pounds, right? That's for their flagship one. Remember that $4,000 receiver, right? But if we go back to that entry-level receiver that we were looking at previously, which is right here, that $299 receiver, we can see the difference, right? So we go down here and then look at the general. So 16 pounds, right? So everything, the entire amp for 5 channels with the processor and the preamp section is a total 16 pounds. And we see the weight when we go up to that $4,000 Denon, it's 50 pounds, okay? So when we look at the Rotel, we see that, yeah, we're at 50 pounds. But okay, let's look at the power output here. What do we see? 2 channels driven, 200 watts, but that's into 4 ohms, right? So again, that's a lower resistance than typical, right? The 8 ohm one is kind of the more apples to apples comparison, if you see that there, and we're at 135 watts per channel. So again, that's in line with like what we saw from the other companies. But the difference here is they have a 7 channel driven rating as well. So that's for all channels driven in this case. And it's 100 watts. So 100 watts with all channels driven at the same time. That's pretty hefty. While having a pretty low THD of 0.05. We see the frequency response is also generally pretty extended. The analog bypass is 10 hertz all the way up to 100 kilohertz. whereas the digital inputs is still 20 to 20. But here's the thing I want you to pay attention to. This is the signal to noise ratio that I kind of mentioned briefly looking at the Anthem. The Anthem was 91. We see here that the digital one is 96. So that's pretty good, okay? But what happens when we go to a Rotel power amplifier? So this is Rotel, but this is a dedicated power amplifier. This is not a receiver. There's no preamp and there's no processor. So we're in the world of separates here, okay? And we can see a good A to B comparison. So this is just the amp. This is just 5-channel amp, by the way, as well. Not 7, not 9, not 11, just 5 channels. So what happens? Well, first of all, look at that weight. 80 pounds, 79 pounds, just for the amp. So again, when you're building a high power, high quality amplifier, it's going to take heft. Look at that weight number when you look at your receiver, etc., and your amplifier. So we went from 50 pounds with the receiver, with everything included, to 80 pounds for just the amp here, right? Now, we see here at the top level, it says 5 times 200 watts. We're going to delve into that. It says class AB, like I mentioned, right? So that's the traditional amp, the big amps that we see, class AB, okay? Notice that this power supply here is much bigger than we saw in a receiver, right? And it's only powering 5 channels, but it's much, much bigger. So what do we get now? 200 watts per channel, but cha-ching, all channels driven. So we're not looking at just 2 channels at the same time anymore. We saw that we kind of capped out with the receiver, where the Denon $4,000 receiver was only rated at 2 channels driven at the same time, and it topped out at 150 watts, if I recall, right? We topped out. This amplifier is not $4,000, and it's 200 watts with all channels driven at the same time. That Denon receiver at $4,000 is probably more like 100 watts with all its channels driven. You know, so we're talking double the power. Again, a lot more robust. But also, look at the rest of the numbers. Full frequency range, 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, less than 0.03% distortion. Less than, right? Look at the frequency response. It's much more extended, 10 hertz to 100 kilohertz across the entire band. That's way beyond human hearing. So it's able to achieve that power, 200 watts per channel. All channels driven into 8 ohms, but across a much wider frequency range than we saw in receivers as well, with less distortion at that. But here's the real kicker, guys. This is the number to see when you talk about going from an integrated receiver to a separate amplifier. This is the key number here, guys. Signal to noise ratio. If you recall, we saw 91 decibels on the Anthem. We saw 96 decibels with the Rotel receiver, but now we're at 116 decibels. That is the real difference. What that means is that much, much more of the sound that you actually hear is the actual pure source of the sound. We're not hearing any noise anymore. And that's really the big difference when you have that more robust power supply and more high-grade materials. You can eliminate a lot more of the noise from the signal. What that sounds like to you is that the audio, the sound that you hear in your movies, everything, the voices coming from the center channel is going to be so much clearer and cleaner. All of the separation and audio you hear from the surrounds and the music you hear in the background is going to be so much clearer. But the real difference is when you look at that power, it's like, okay, 150 watts to 200 watts. You can't look at just those numbers. That's 200 watts across all channels equally. So you're going to get a much more even distribution of sound and perceived volume. But the signal to noise ratio is really that you do not have to turn up the volume nearly as high to get the same level of sound. So think about it like this. With a lower grade piece of electronics, a receiver or amplifier, let's say that for the sake of argument that you had a signal to noise ratio, like I mentioned, of 90 decibels, okay? Pretty good, okay? But in that world, let's just say that you had to turn up the volume to 100, right, to hear the sound at a level where you wanted it. you want to crank it. You want to hear your sound and hear your movie at a certain level. And to get to that level with 90 dB signal noise ratio, you have to turn it all the way up to like 100 to get to that same level. And when you do that now, you're demanding a lot more power and straining of that amplifier. So you're playing it at that level to hear the sound, the actual music and the actual movie to the level that you want. But along with that, you're getting a lot more noise with that, right? So it doesn't sound as clear and you're straining the amp. What happens when you go to something like this and you now have 116, 110 plus, dB signal to noise ratio is, in that same analogy, instead of having to turn the volume up to 100, you only have to turn the volume up to 70. At 70, you perceive to be getting a lot more pure sound, and it's going to sound louder because you're hearing a lot more of the actual sound without that noise. So you don't have to turn it up as loud, right? So that's why the power ratings matter. People think that more watts mean more power, more volume, and that's not true, right? Volume is actually dictated by the speaker and the speaker sensitivity, which is another video, right? But what you do get is the ability to turn up the volume a lot more while still maintaining the same level of clarity and the same level of detail. You don't lose that when you turn the volume up because you don't have as much noise. The reason why you lose that with a lower quality receiver, let's say, is because when you turn the volume up, the noise gets amplified as well. So now you're hearing a lot more noise as well. So that is a key metric. Again, that took me like 10 years before I really understood that. Like, what is the difference between 150 watt and a receiver, even a high quality receiver that's thousands of dollars, versus a separate power amp that may cost half the price, which is the case here, right? What is that difference? Well, the difference is largely not just higher power, because you do get more power, clearly. We never saw a receiver with 200 watts, definitely not with all channels driven, right? But it's that signal to noise ratio, guys. That's the real difference. So even if we go back to Anthem, we saw that they had 91 dB on their receiver, right? But what happens when we look at like their high-end amplifier here, for example, okay? What do we see there? Well, look at this. This is a 2-channel amp because this is designed more for music, but I wanted to show you guys what's possible. Here it is. So here's the power output. We see continuous power, 2 channels, full frequency range, less than 1% distortion, 400 watts. Never could see anything like that in a receiver. But the key thing, look at some of these other numbers here. Look at these distortion numbers, guys. 0.0007% distortion at 1 kilohertz, and they give you multiple frequencies to show you, and then 0.004 at 20 kilohertz. That is a difference, right? We never saw a receiver with that level of distortion. We saw 0.08, we saw 0.05, we never saw 0.00 anything. We definitely didn't see 0.000 anything. So that's one difference. But then look at the signal to noise ratio, guys. At 400 watts, the signal to noise ratio is 121 dB. Remember, the Anthem receiver was 91 dB, right? The Rotel receiver was 96 dB, okay? That high-end Denon receiver, I happen to know, is also in the 90s. I think it's like 96. It's in the upper 90s. We don't even get 100 dB with a receiver, right? The Rotel amplifier was 116, which is really good, by the way. Anything above 110 it's going to be really, really good. This thing is pushing 121 dB. That's the difference here, guys. And again, that just level of, you're getting all sound, no noise. Turn it up, crank it up. Pure sound, it's stable. You're getting, it's going to be consistent. And, that's the difference here. This amplifier, by the way, is $6,000 for just 2 channels, right? This is the audiophile level. This is a whole nother level. But I wanted to show you guys what that can look like, right? Again, the key takeaways here is, you cannot take, these power ratings at face value. You do get what you pay for. And, what you really care about with a high quality amp is low distortion and low noise. It's not just about the power. Look at, let's go back to the demo. Look at, the frequency, the resistance, the number of channels being driven, and the distortion. And if you can also, if you get to that level, look at that signal to noise ratio. That's going to become more of an issue when you start talking about separates. That's the big difference with separates, guys. and you do get what you pay for. So that doesn't mean that you can't have a kick-ass system with a receiver that's $1,000 or $1,500. But just know what you're getting. And again, remember that everything is going to scale accordingly with your system. If you have a $1,500 receiver and you pair that with $10,000 speakers, that doesn't make much sense. The speakers are not going to be getting fed the power that they really need, right? The quality that they really need, right? Similarly, if you have a $500 pair of speakers and you went ahead and got a $2,500 receiver, right? The speakers are not going to do that receiver justice, right? So that matters as well. And that's something that, I'll talk a lot more about in later videos as well. So hopefully now you guys know a lot more about this stuff. You know what to look for. You got some examples of some companies, some brands, some web sites and resources to use. But pay attention to this stuff when you're looking for that next receiver. Okay? So, True Techno Gamer signing off. If you made it this far, thank you. Appreciate it. Hopefully the information was useful. Please like, subscribe, give me comments. More to come. Thanks a lot.